All right, today we're going to dive deep into the very fabric of the world's largest democracy. We're talking about the Constitution of India. I mean, this is the rule book for over 1 billion people. We're going to look at how its grand principles actually play out on the ground. So let's get into it. And this really is the big question, isn't it? I mean, how does a nation with just this staggering diversity, we're talking languages, religions, cultures all woven together, how does it function as one single unified democracy? Well, the answer, as we're about to see, is all in a really carefully crafted framework of ideas and institutions. So, to really unpack all of this, we're going to break it down into 4 key parts. First up, we'll look at the foundational ideas, the philosophical soul of the nation. Then, we'll get into the engine of democracy, the how it all works. After that, we're going to face the tough stuff, the gap between the rights promised on paper and the reality people live every day. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at how India's constitution isn't just a dusty old book, but a living, breathing document. All right, let's kick things off with the big ideas, because, before we can even talk about the laws and the systems, we have to understand the core philosophies that the Indian state was actually built on. First on the list is social justice. Now, this isn't just some vague idea about being fair. It's a really proactive principle that's baked right into the Constitution. The whole point is to correct historical wrongs and lift up communities that were systematically held back for generations. It's about making sure that the family you're born into doesn't decide your entire future. Next up, we have secularism. And you really have to understand that the Indian version is pretty unique. It's not about kicking religion out of public life, not at all. The goal was never for the state to be irreligious, but to be equi-religious. So as leaders like Nehru saw it, the state's job is to be this neutral guardian, protecting every single faith equally, without ever picking favorites. And this comparison here really drives that point home. If you look at Turkey under Ataturk in the early 20th century, the government was very hands-on, actively controlling religion to try and modernize the state. Nehru's vision for India? Completely different. It was about a state that wasn't hostile to religion at all, but was equally supportive of all faiths, creating a space where they could all coexist. This idea is just captured so perfectly by the poet Rabindranath Tagore. He was a huge champion for independence, but he also warned against a narrow, blind nationalism. For him, the end goal wasn't just to build a nation-state, it was to build a society on universal human values. That spirit of humanism, that's truly part of India's foundational DNA. Okay, so you've got these incredible big ideas, but how do you actually turn them into a system that works day to day? Well, now let's look at the engine of democracy, the actual machinery that puts these principles into practice. And sitting at the very heart of this engine is the Constitution. Seriously, think of it as the ultimate source code for the entire country. It lays out the whole structure of government, how power is divided, and this is the most important part, the fundamental rights that belong to every single citizen, rights that no government is supposed to be able to take away. So who guards this all-important rulebook? That would be the judiciary. India has this integrated, tiered court system. You've got the local courts at the bottom, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court at the very top. This whole structure is designed to settle disputes and, crucially, to be the final interpreter of the Constitution. They're the ones who make sure the government stays within its legal lanes. And of course, you can't have a democracy without elections. What you're looking at here is a map of the 543 Lok Sabha, or parliamentary constituencies. Every single one of these little geographic areas elects its own representative. This is how the government is formed, by the will of the people. It's the most direct way for citizens to have a say in how they're governed. But managing a democracy this incredibly diverse is a constant tightrope walk. This slide shows 2 paths, 2 very different stories. On one hand, you have Belgium, which successfully managed its diversity by sharing power. But then you have Sri Lanka, which went the other way, adopting policies that favored the majority. And that tragically led to a brutal civil war. It just goes to show how absolutely critical those inclusive, power-sharing structures that India's founders tried to build really are. All right, so now we're going to shift gears. We've talked about the system, but what about the people? What happens when those grand, beautiful promises in the Constitution clash with the complex and often really harsh realities of daily life? This is where the real struggle for rights happens. Let's just take a basic, right? Something as simple as access to water. Think about this. A guest staying in a luxury hotel might use up to 1,600 liters of water a day. That's 80 buckets. 80. Now, a person living in a nearby slum might get less than 20 liters. That's 1 bucket. This isn't just about a lack of resources, folks. This is a crystal clear picture of deep, staggering economic inequality.
And that inequality, it's not random. Just look at this data. It shows how poverty hits historically marginalized communities the hardest. The poverty rates for scheduled tribes, these are indigenous communities, and scheduled castes, groups that were historically oppressed by the caste system, are way, way higher than the national average. It's a stark reminder that the constitutional promise of social justice is still a battle being fought every single day.
And sometimes that battle gets brutal. This is a real incident from a village in Odisha. The Lit men stood up for their dignity. They refused to perform a demeaning customary act at a wedding, and the retaliation was horrific. The Lit women were assaulted, paraded naked. I mean, this isn't some abstract theoretical problem. This is a raw, painful, real-world fight for basic human dignity.
And this is exactly where the Constitution becomes so critical. The horrific acts we just talked about, they aren't just social evils. They are direct violations of fundamental rights guaranteed in the rulebook. The right to equality, the right to life and dignity, the complete abolition of untouchability, these are legally protected. The state has a constitutional duty to protect its citizens from this kind of thing. So, this brings us to our final and maybe most important section. With all these massive challenges, how does the whole framework even hold up? How does it adapt? Well, the answer is in its most remarkable feature, its ability to evolve. See, the people who wrote the Constitution, they were smart. They knew they couldn't possibly predict every single challenge the future would hold. So what they created was a living document. It's not some static text frozen in 1950. It's designed to be interpreted, debated, and adopted by new generations to meet the needs of a society that is always, always changing. And a perfect example of this in action is something called the Basic Structure Doctrine. This was an idea that the Supreme Court itself came up with. Back in 1973, in a landmark case, it basically said, look, Parliament can amend the Constitution, sure, but it cannot destroy its core features, things like democracy, secularism, the rule of law. That single ruling, that bit of judicial innovation, now acts as the ultimate firewall protecting India's entire democratic fabric. And so we end right back where he started, with a question. The Indian Constitution has proven to be incredibly resilient, balancing just immense diversity and tackling these deep historic inequalities. But as new challenges keep coming, economic, social, technological, its ability to breathe, to adapt, and to protect the rights of every single citizen, that will continue to be the ultimate test of this grand, ongoing democratic experiment.